Hello, good afternoon. I'm Scott Figenshow, Chief Executive at Community Housing Aotearoa. I'm joined here with Dr. Kay Saville-Smith, who's the Director of the Affordable Housing for Generations program of our Building Better Homes, Towns, and Cities National Science Challenge, and a Director at CRESA. I also acknowledge Kay as our Chief Science Advisor for our Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, although she is not here today in any official HUD or government capacity. We also have with us Brennan Rigby, who's our Manager Systems Shift for the Shift Aotearoa project here at Community Housing Aotearoa. Brennan is going to kick us off first with a mihi for us as our part of our welcome from your mates here in New Zealand. Brennan?
Kia ora koutou, kia ora no tātou. Firstly, we'd like to just acknowledge the Indigenous people of all of the lands and places in which you're all resting your feet today while you're joining this conference. Me atu kia koutou katoa, mihi mahana no Aotearoa. Secondly, he mihi atu tēnei no Whanganui-a-Taro, our capital, Wellington, where Scott and Kay are joining you from, our mana whenua down there, Ngāti Toa, Rangatira and Te Aotearoa, who we have very close links with in our office at CHAR. And he mihi tēnei no te nā Paimaunga o Waitakere, nā tangata whenua o te Kaurawa Maki here in West Auckland, where I'm coming to you from higher up in Te Ika Maui. Nō reira, he mihi tēnei, he mihi mahana tēnei no Aotearoa kia koutou katoa. Kia ora, Scott.
Kia ora, Brennan. Thanks for that. Look, in this afternoon session, I want to just thank everyone for joining us, and thanks to our partners at the Community Housing Industry Association for asking us to join you this afternoon and share a few thoughts here from Aotearoa. I'll start with just a few slides around some kind of opening topics here. After I finish that, I'll turn to Kay, and Kay will present some of the big themes that we're seeing here in Aotearoa and that we're working on at a macro level. And then following Kay, Brennan will tell us all about the Shift Aotearoa project, and then we'll get into a bit of conversation around some of these key topics. I've called this Some Thinking from Your Mates Across the Ditch, mostly because we, as a peak body for community housing here in New Zealand, quite frankly, our members know how to deliver great service. They know how to deliver quality homes for Kiwis who are facing housing stress. We know how to do that work. What we don't seem to be able to do is to crack the nut at delivering at scale and pace in our country. The place that community housing sits in New Zealand is still is not as fulsome as what we think it could and should be. And so we want to be able to really activate that quite a bit. What I'm showing now is just a quick snapshot of as of December, when we prepared our last briefing for incoming ministers. The community housing sector in New Zealand is delivering roughly 8,500 homes. That's only 1% of the over 1.8 million residential dwellings in New Zealand. So we're still kind of a minnow in terms of overall delivery. And of that 18,000 homes, you'll see the blue half of the circle is what we deliver that's funded by the income-related rent subsidy. It's known as social housing, or under the current government, they like to call it public housing. And it's the long-term rent subsidy funded housing. So, but that's only half of what the community housing sector is delivering. And this is where we've often had most of our challenge with government. Over 4,800 units, the orange quarter down there, does not get a long-term rent subsidy attached to it, but it's affordable rental housing that community housing providers largely built and acquired over decades, largely funded under the model of a 50% capital grant, and offered a rent that was probably 75% of the area median rent for those lower income households that just were not able to afford housing in the unrestricted market. The green area represents this massive growth we've had in transitional housing. So there's over 3,500 places of transitional and a few other emergency housing that the community housing sector operates. Our worry for this is that it's certainly great that it's providing short-term accommodation, but because of our lack of enough adequate, permanent, affordable rental and ownership options, This short-term housing, people are finding themselves in there for much, much longer than the 12-week purported stay, often for multiple months, and it could become years. So it's an area of great concern for us. The orange slice at the top is the progressive home ownership space. That is an area of growth. We're seeing now with a $400 million progressive home ownership fund. One of our biggest successes has been, I've got the Kiwi Buy poster on the back here, a sector-led initiative to work with government on the policy work that has really helped shape how that progressive home ownership rolls out. Still a lot of work to go, and it's still not working for our iwi Māori pathway, so more in that space. As a couple big themes, I thought I'd share with you what I'm calling a couple new dynamics at play here in New Zealand. After the Leilani Fahar, the UN Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing's visit in February of last year, so just before COVID, that work, her report, helped stimulate a real basis of support for our Human Rights Commission to develop the guidelines on the right to a decent home. So that's in the red box here. It is quite, for us, groundbreaking that our Human Rights Commission has picked this up, not only to do the guidelines work, but also their link with what they're calling in the blue square, the in-work poverty. So that connection between income and the right to housing is quite strong and an area that's forming quite a lot of our work. Those guidelines are available from our Human Rights Commission website. They're definitely worth a read, and it forms quite a lot of work that we're doing on an ongoing basis. The second new dynamic is really that this is some graphics from our partner and sister organization, Te Matapihi. They're the peak body for Māori housing in New Zealand. They and many providers, together with Hurimoana Dennis, who leads Te Puia Memorial Marae in Auckland, Hurimoana has led this claim in the Waitangi Tribunal. Its number is Y2750, and it's a housing policy and services inquiry. The hearings are been broadcast and available to watch on YouTube. There's a set of both tangata whenua evidence, so the evidence of Māori's experience of homelessness and houselessness. And then there's a set of technical evidence, and we're really proud here at Community Housing Aotearoa to have been asked to provide some of that evidence just in support of their claim. So many are asking, is this going to make a difference? Because Waitangi Tribunal hearings and the reports that come from them are not binding on governments. I'm going to put my money that I think this one is going to make a massive difference in New Zealand, partly because it's documenting the extent to which housing and houselessness are problematic and just simply don't work for folks, but also because so many of the solutions come from when we invest in people, in communities, in iwi and Māori providers to deliver their own solutions. And I think the consensus is tipping in that direction. So now I just wanted to do a quick fast forward. I've been really appreciated through Wendy Hayhurst's invitation and our colleagues Jess and at CHIA for the opportunity to participate in the work that you're doing around mandatory inclusionary zoning. So I thought I would just kind of quickly make this jump into, does mandatory inclusionary zoning advance the right to housing? Well, first of all, I'd like to put in purport in there a big yes. When we get to the discussion part later, Kay and Brennan may have quite a bit to challenge me on that. And I guess the reason why I would say that it does advance the right to housing is, first and foremost, you included the M word when you designed your work program on this. Mandatory. We're having a very managed discussion in New Zealand at the moment. We do quite a lot with our partners in local government and at councils on inclusionary zoning. We are thrilled. We see a window opening in our resource management reforms that government is leading, where the idea of value capture may gain some space. So that's all very encouraging. But quite frankly, folks, I love it that you just said, yeah, if we're going to talk about it, it's got to be mandatory. So good on you for that. And in your bit around what needs to happen, the way you've talked about the roles that the Australian government needs to play, about a national consistency and a framework, that it means that developers will find it possible to promote rational inclusion rezoning policies, because they will find that it's how we make housing socially sustainable. Then you also talk about the role state governments play, and that they must pass their own legislation to enable it at the local level, and then following on what local councils must do. So I just want to give a big shout out. I think you're on the right track. And following on from that, so how would mandatory inclusion rezoning fit in a rights-based approach? Well, again, using our New Zealand lens, we believe we need to have a treaty-based, rights-based strategy adopted at central government. We're talking about whether enshrining that in law through a National Housing Strategy Act is the right way to go. If we follow what our colleagues in Canada have done, that was the path that they used. And that would be the central government framework that would create the key local government enablement. I think the second piece in that work you've done that again supports a rights-based approach is you've just put a stake in the ground and said that value capture is an impost on land prices. Let's just make the statement. Economists will debate it till the cows come home. So let's just make the statement. Let's accept that that's a fact of how things work, and that by doing so, it means that we can deliver affordable housing without necessarily spreading that cost onto other homes. There's probably other things we'd add, open for discussion on that. So just offering that. So from my view here at Community Housing Aotearoa, here's a few things that we're testing in New Zealand. Asking ourselves and our colleagues around the country the question, what does a rights-based approach foster that we can't do today? First and foremost, we think it lifts up certainty for the long term. We're hoping it will foster that cross-party alignment and those enduring commitments. And then hopefully it can move us from transactions to transparency. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop my sharing here and then turn over to Kay here in a moment. And we'll keep going on here. There we go. Now let me bring this up here. Kay, let me turn over to you here. I'll move the slides for you a bit here. And oh my gosh, we've gone to the wrong one.
Oh, no, that's good. Start there.
Start there?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Kia ora tātou. It's a real pleasure to be here. And more, well, I can't see you, but who I can see is Scott and Brennan, both who work assiduously within the community housing sector and with people who are trying to make our communities better to ensure that people have a decent home. So it's, both an honour and a pleasure. I've got a series of slides, but I'm going to talk to them. They're there if you want them, and I'm just going to run through a thing. The main things that I'm really concerned about is to give a sort of understanding where New Zealand has been and is going, or has come to really, at the moment, because that presents some real challenges for the community housing sector. And those are a little bit idiosyncratic in New Zealand compared with Australia, actually. We often think that, we're very alike, but actually we have a lot of differences. And the main difference, I think, is that New Zealand became a country which dedicated itself to running its housing system through the housing market. In fact, now you could argue that it's really running its housing system through the property or the real estate market, not even the housing market. So in the 1990s, we moved to a system in which we got rid of all the tools that we had in the toolbox, which were a mix of both supply and demand side tools. We put into play an accommodation supplement, which I'll come back to later, and we essentially, which was through the welfare system, not through the housing vote, it's through vote social welfare. And so we had a housing system which was based on the idea that housing will work, people will get what they need, people will get access to public housing, their right to housing, because we've signed up to rights before, and Brennan, I'm sure, will comment on that, will be achieved through the activation of this housing market. And if it's not, then there'll be just a little bit of additional residual welfare support on the side. And that's had a huge impact on where we are today. It is an impact that has been barely recognised, actually, interestingly enough. New Zealand started with probably one of the better housing systems in the world in 1988. That's just before the reforms. We had the reforms. It's taken 30 years to actually dismantle that. And there were some problems around access to housing, particularly in terms of Māori rural housing, often which was embedded in issues around colonisation, the pushing of Māori into urban areas, etc. But essentially, there were a number of tools that were available. Those were stripped away, and now we've got seriously a housing crisis where we've got close to 80,000 people who are within our definition of homelessness. And it's a wide definition, probably by world standards, but nevertheless an important one. So I'm just going to move on to some of the things that have come out of that in terms of the definitions that we use, because they're a bit different in New Zealand to everywhere else at the moment. And we've done that because the market housing system hasn't worked, and we've had to cobble together a whole number of things to try and make it work. And we've done that by firstly saying to community housing, we're with you, you're there, we're all hand in hand, come together, provide long-term affordable housing, particularly to provide for people with special needs, complex needs, high levels of support requirements, then a bit later into intermediate tenures, and we called that social housing. So we went through a sort of brief period in the early 2000s around that. And then we went through a period where it was very clear that our residual state housing, which we all would call public housing, was going to be disposed of in some way. To make that palatable, both commercially and socially, we started attaching to other players the opportunity to get the very high subsidies, relative subsidies, that public housing, state housing in New Zealand, because we're highly centralised, unlike you in New Zealand. And we called all of those places public housing. So we now have public housing, which is not owned by the state at all, nor is it owned by local government. Some of it is, but some of it's not. But where the community housing sector provides housing, as they have been asked to do, through the mechanism of the income-related rent subsidy that Scott talked about, as opposed to the accommodation supplement, which I'll talk about again in a minute, then that is called public housing. So in a sense, for the community housing sector, part of its issue is how it can stop being simply the vassal agent of government, as opposed to being an advocate, superior gold star provider of housing and decent communities. So this has changed if you like, the way in which we think about housing, and it's certainly changed the position of community housing providers, some of whom are what we traditionally non-profit providers, but legally in New Zealand they could be for-profit providers as well. So I'm going to just briefly talk about the housing trajectories that we have experienced over that period of time. Essentially, we've had a situation where a society with very high levels of owner occupation. If you were born in 1927 to 1932, you reach 65, which is retirement age in New Zealand, although retirement is not compulsory. Over 80%, almost 90%, and in some areas, particularly rural areas and provincial areas, over 90% of the population at that time of the 65 plus, people turning 65, would be owner-occupiers, mortgage-free generally owner-occupiers. We will be in 20 years' time, people in that situation turning 65 will be lucky if we hit 50% of that population in owner occupation. And yet, much of our legislation and much of our assumptions about our services, including health services, are predicated on this idea of very high levels of owner occupation, which is simply not true. We've had very high house price rises, and that's something that you have also experienced. But essentially, what we've come down to is a situation where, despite lowering interest rates, we've got a house price in the lower house price median income ratio of around 7 times by 2013. It's gone up again since there. And a house price in a lower quartile section using lower quartile land is around 5.6. That's an enormous difference to 1966, where it was around 2.8 times the median income. And there's a table there that I'm not going to go through, but it tells you the same story. Is we ain't got houses not only for low income households, we haven't got affordable housing for modest income households. The very households that we have always assumed in New Zealand would be able to largely, with a little bit of assistance, usually from owner occupation type assistance, would be able to take care of themselves and pre-save for their old age. So that's been a huge change for us. And our problem over the last 30 years, because of our dedication to this paradigm of the market being the way to run the housing system, is we've cobbled together responses when things don't seem to work. And we haven't faced up to the fact that housing is expensive. So I constantly hear when people are talking about the community housing sector, they always say to me, those community housing providers, they always want money. And I go, but doesn't everyone that's building a house want money? Whether it's a household or a commercial developer, everyone wants money. The issue is, how do you get it, and how do you generate the housing that our community needs? We have, of course, accompanied that sort of meanness of spirit and our lack of recognition, both within the rental side and within our attitude towards owner occupation, as opposed to property investment, which I'll come back to in a minute. Spent an awful lot of money frittering funding and investment. In fact, it's not investment at all, but frittering our housing assistance away. So at the moment, annually, we've got a budget of $2.4 billion. It's the third highest. It used to be the second highest before COVID. Welfare expenditure on the accommodation supplement. It's the biggest single government expenditure in housing. So all the stuff for long-term affordable housing, et cetera, is nowhere near this expenditure that we're putting into an untied assistance to households in the mainly in the rental market. You can also access if you're an owner-occupier, but essentially it is broadly a subsidy to private landlords, and I'll come back to that. So at the moment, we've got very little bang for the buck out of that, and we spend that sort of money, and overall, it's not saying that particular households that get it don't need it, they certainly do, but overall, spending that amount of money really only takes 11,000 odd households out of the unaffordable range and puts them into the affordable range. It's not a great return. And so we now are in a situation where we have homelessness being driven, we have unaffordable rents, we have huge expenditure on emergency and transitional housing because low and modest income households cannot get permanent housing solutions, either on the rental market or in owner occupation. And as you know, misery in the housing system trickles down. If you can't sort out the middle, they push down on low modest income households, and they push down onto very vulnerable households. And then finally, I just wanted to have a little bit of a chat about this next slide.
Okay.
Subsidy and what it's meant. We are in the state of denial about the depth of financialisation of housing. We have failed to really leverage the ability of the community housing sector to help us solve that problem. And you'll see that big public housing numbers, those really have come out of what was previously long-term affordable housing and are now in public housing, which is close to transitional and emergency almost at the moment. And the way in which we've spent money has really led to a very interesting problem. Apart from an aggregate undersupply that we have in New Zealand, between 1991 and 2018, our total occupied housing stock, owner-occupied and rental, increased by 41%. Not enough, but actually not a bad increase. But our numbers in the rental sector of stock increased by almost 81%. And the numbers of rental housing, or the numbers of the stock in the private rented sector increased by a massive 122%. Those people that own that stock, have invested in that stock, they're not service landlords, they're property investors. That represents a huge financialisation, and it has squeezed the community housing sector. It's very hard for the community housing sector to provide affordable housing while essentially competing with some very cashed up, highly subsidised private landlords.
Great. Okay, thank you. I always learn something extra when we get to do these pieces here.
Yeah.
Now, before I get into my commentary about Brennan, talk to us about the Shift Aotearoa and how we embarked on this journey.
Sure. I'll firstly, thanks everyone. It's great to be here with you. And I've got to say, this is, it's always humbling and kind of exciting and slightly intimidating to be even just in a room with Scott and Kay, let alone on a international Zoom call, because there's, to be honest, and I don't mean any disrespect, there's like at least 60 years of deep housing experience and thinking coming to you from across the ditch at the moment, and I can assure you that only about 2.5 of them are mine.
Your hair still has color in it, mine doesn't.
And the rest, categorically, as you've just heard, belongs to Scott and Kay, who's just, in a blasé fashion, traverse issues. I don't even know where I can add anything much. But so that's Kay, and Scott, I've got to acknowledge you as well, because, for all of you who are listening, Scott's the guy in the public sector who said, I'm going to take a punt on the right to housing. I'm going to step right outside this policy analysis and trying to beat my head on the wall of government. I'm going to try something new. And he went hunting for some philanthropic funding to enable his organisation to do that. And I'm merely the lucky recipient of a role where I get to kind of try and bring that to life. So I just wanted to acknowledge you two and give some context to my relationship with these two great thinkers. So I'm the manager of system shifts for Community Housing Aotearoa, which basically means I'm quite closely aligned with Leilani Faha's global movement, which is the shift, which if you're not familiar with, the website is Make the Shift, not just the shift. But she's pretty clear in this space, and the reason I wanted to come and work for Scott on this project is because I was already following Ms. Faha's work as the UN Special Rapporteur. So she's really clear. Her new project, The Shift, is really quite simply about interrogating financialisation and working out the ways to minimise its impact in housing systems, and of course implementing the right to housing. So in this conversation, I'm going to stay in my lane, because all of that policy stuff and the technical, the data, the insights, I mean, it's incredible, but it's let's just say I'll stay in my lane. So that's what I do for Scott, and I really enjoy it. So the question is, how do you do these things? And I guess on the financialization issue, it's interesting to just note quickly that, we had what was teed up as a pretty significant housing announcement about 3 weeks ago in New Zealand here from the government. And actually they did two things, which were probably not a surprise to many people, but they were actually moves that indicated a willingness to attempt to definancialize the housing system. So they didn't do that overnight, but they changed the tax deductibility. rule, which was enabling investors. You guys, I can see you just dying to jump in and talk about the details. Changed the tax deductibility rules for investment houses, and also extended our bright line test from 5 years to 10 years. So that's an anti-flipping regime, which was actually brought in by a previous national government, and the current Labor government have just extended that. They extended it immediately to 5 years and now to 10 years. And as the commentators say, it's starting to look a little bit like a capital gains tax. And, you know, those are some of the signals in our housing system which are going to start to say to investors, actually, this environment's changing a little bit. So you might want to think about your future activity in the housing system. And frankly, that's what we want investors to be thinking. You know, we want it to be just a little bit of a tougher game, I think. So that's the shift, and we're doing the shift Aotearoa, which of course is the New Zealand iteration, and we work really closely with, well, I talk with Leilani a lot, and she's got a recent comment on the ownership issue, which we might get to a little bit too. So in terms of implementing the right to housing, we kind of, as Scott's already alluded to, kind of, I guess, got a little bit of luck, good timing, good management, and most especially, as with all of these things, good relationships. And about 18 months ago, the Human Rights Commission came forward wanting to develop guidelines on the right to housing. So that's our national human rights organisation mandated by the government, you know, stepping into the housing debate and saying we want to put a marker in here. Now they've got a statutory mandate to create guidelines on human rights, as you'd imagine. And so they decided to do that on the right to housing. The guidelines, of course, actually, so Scott's already shown you the website. They're actually still in draft form. The final guidelines themselves are going to be launched actually really soon, in the next couple of weeks, which is exciting. I'm personally looking forward to going and putting it in the hard copy of the guidelines on the right to housing into the hands of tenancy managers for our state housing organisation, Kāinga Ora, and into the hands of tenants, and convening community meetings where we can pick up this document and talk about it. And to that end, we're going to hopefully produce a summary too, because the 32 pages, you know, is going to be tough to get through. So the Human Rights Commission really stepped forward on that, and those guidelines won't be legally binding themselves, but they do create a platform. And the Human Rights Commission's done that really successfully about 8 years ago, where they provided guidelines on the right to be free from discrimination. And if you look back through a sort of a history of how that landed, it landed really forcefully exactly where the Human Rights Commission wanted it to land, which was in the public sector, because the public sector suddenly understood how to implement protections against discrimination, and they became really powerful over time. So the guidelines we're looking forward to. I've got to make one more point on the guidelines. The Human Rights Commission was challenged deeply to interrogate how the human right to housing and the Treaty of Waitangi sit together, and how that relationship works for Māori, especially in the Crown Māori relationship. How do Māori understand having a human right to housing while also wanting to have treaty rights? And I can only really encourage you to come and read the guidelines sometime for an understanding of how well the Human Rights Commission did, how deeply they considered that question, which is, of course, precisely what we have to do with all of these human rights questions, is really deeply consider them. So look, a few more things. One is, you know, obviously, possibly like in Australia, there's not really a policy environment which is enabling of human rights, but at the same time, it's slightly tricky. So there are some human rights, like New Zealanders do have the right to be free from discrimination by landlords. But for a given person going for a rental property to prove that they were discriminated against is almost impossible. And we get very quickly into a counterproductive position where the less a landlord says in refusing someone's application, the better they are protected from a claim of discrimination. So the problem arises for the landlord when they say too much. And so it's tricky, but it exists. But, you know, it's fair to say with the right to housing, we're really sort of calling into a bit of an empty space at the moment, and that's okay. As Scott sort of alluded to, we're really clear that, well, I often ask myself a question which I think Kay and Scott probably find a little bit naive, but I sort of think our housing environment has actually changed a lot in the last 3 years, or maybe 4 years, with the Labour-led coalition government coming in 2017, and now we have a single-party Labour government from late last year, and they really have been trying to get the machinery of state housing supply up and running. So we are in a very different environment than we were 4 years ago, but as you've heard from Scott and Kay, it's not exactly a perfect environment. What we understand, though, is that we need to find a way of creating a bipartisan housing policy set, a bipartisan approach to housing, so we can stop feeling like at every election our housing policy environment's going to change. So one of the things that we've been talking about a lot, I've been working on a lot, is the idea of a national right to housing strategy, or a national housing strategy based on the right to housing. And that's a part of the narrative that comes from Leilani Fahar and her UN reports. So that's probably the key intervention that we're working towards. And a part of that is, importantly, applies to our state housing provider, which is we refer to as Kāinga Ora. We need to ask ourselves questions. So in 2017, 2018, the government created social objectives for our state housing provider. It wasn't super meaningful at the time, but if they got taken away, that would be definitely a step in the wrong direction. We also had the government remove the need for our state housing supplier to provide a dividend back to government. And that's okay. And it wasn't a huge move either, but we need to make sure that that doesn't get put back into place. So suddenly we're needing to provide a dividend out of our state housing. So as with Kay and Scott, there's a lot of frontiers where we're working. And I'll pass it back to you, Scott.
Great. Thanks, Brennan. Look, if I can just ask all of our audience, if you've got questions, please use the Q&A function on there and type those questions in and we'll come to them. Thank you, Rachel, for that encouragement and that you're keen to hear the Kiwi experience. What I might do as folks are coming through with their questions is, look, Brennan, Kay, and I do have the fortunate opportunity to get to work together. And I couldn't imagine a better group of friends and colleagues to be able to be on this journey with and tackling this quite tough stuff. So I thought I'd kick us off with a bit of a discussion that actually we were having as we were waiting to start the session here. Kay says I'm very naughty on this. Look, there's a discussion around home ownership going on in New Zealand, and this kind of tension between home ownership and rental. And a few years ago we thought, oh, home ownership's just too hard. Let's just get everybody renting and in a better rental environment. And then, Kay, your work around the accommodation supplement basically showed us that, well, heck, we've spent billions of dollars giving us little bit of rental subsidy. It hasn't delivered good quality stock. And for that same money, we could have actually helped people into owning their own home. And so, but we were having this chat about, so should we be centering or decentering? And we actually are trying to work that through ourselves here. So I don't know, Kay, Brennan, which of you wants to pick up on that first and continue our discussion?
Brennan, I saw you take a big breath there. So do you want to start or do you want me to start and then you can?
Well, sorry, I promised that I'd finish my little spiel with a reference to a piece of research from New Zealand that I really like, which is called Transformative Housing Policy for Aotearoa New Zealand. Authors Jackie Paul, Jenny MacArthur, Jordan King, and Max Harris, which just has this really nice capture of four key, what do they call them? 4 key paradigms for change. Decolonizing housing policy, which I think is a really significant one. Democratizing housing policy making, which is a really critical one, I think, especially in the human rights space. Participatory policy making, anyone? Let's have some of that. Decommodifying housing, which of course is something we've already talked about in the context of financialization. But finally, the recommendation is change a new paradigm around decentering home ownership.
And that's the problematic one.
That, to me, that's problematic, and I guess that's. Let me just sort of go off piste for a moment there. I've been just reading some work recently called Fair and Equitable Housing in New Zealand, and I was very worried about that framing. And I said, actually, aren't we really trying to frame things around housing as being a right? And firstly, and then secondly, as a need. And the part of the reason I said that was because when the housing reforms happened in the 1990s, there were three themes that were said to drive those reforms: fairness, equity, and tenure neutrality. And yet what have we got? We've got high concentrations of housing wealth among a few, and increasingly the locking out of younger generations from owner occupation. Increasing inequality that is directly related to housing costs. And inequality in New Zealand has not grown hugely if you don't look at housing costs. It has grown, but it's not huge. And we have homelessness. So what worries me about that is when I look at when people talk about home ownership, what they really mean is the ownership of property. And that's a very different thing. And I started off as a housing officer, says, yes, home ownership isn't the answer to everyone, and nor is rental. What we have to do is make sure it's the quality of what people can get it, they can afford it, and that is manageable within their circumstance, that gives them a decent home and a good start to their lives. And what I've seen is this argument about homeowners getting a good suck of the salve being used as a way to strip the rights of housing off people and force people into very vulnerable relations with property investors, not even service landlords most of them. So that's my anxiety about that. And I think what we have is not New Zealand as a home ownership society or even centering home ownership. What we have is a society which has allowed the housing system to be transformed into real estate. That notion of home ownership isn't just something that we feel strongly to. I think we do, but I think we need to go beyond that. So I understand where they're coming from. And Brennan and I agree entirely on the other three. It's only that one that I feel anxious about.
So in some ways, maybe what we're suggesting then is it's not about decentering home ownership, but decentering property investment.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Well, Brennan, is that a bit of consensus from you on that alternative title we've just come up with there, or do you have a different view?
A couple of comments, if that's okay, but I'm happy to move on.
So no, do that, and then we'll go to Rachel's question, and I'll read that out in a moment.
Yeah. So just the comment that Leilani made recently on a call that Leilani Fahar made, which was, she's really clear that she doesn't want it to see anyone. What's the word? Sort of. She just is really concerned that people are sort of saying, let's just not worry about home ownership anymore. Worry about getting more people into home ownership. It's very much the pulling the ladder up behind us sort of metaphor that she's getting at. Just when we're starting to understand the financial implications and this financial meaning of this intergenerational wealth, let's not cut that down. And also Fiona Cram, who's a great kaupapa Māori researcher here in New Zealand, along similar lines, kind of actually in the same conversation, saying, the whole thing that happened with urbanisation for Māori in New Zealand was move into the cities, have a low-income job, and we'll just give you this house, and you can live in it for your life, for your whole life. You don't need to worry. Don't worry about buying a house. Just live in our little state rental with no insulation and all of that stuff. And so that Fiona's point was, Māori have been tricked by that narrative before.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Brennan. That's right.
Good point.
Look, we've got a couple questions coming through here. I'll first, we've got a question from Rachel and a question from Nicholas. I'll do Rachel's question first. I'll just read it out here. Really interesting to hear the distinction between a housing strategy and a right to housing strategy. What do you think would clinch the deal for bipartisan support? Is it about finding the combination of head and heart, or is it something else? What do you?
Well, Brennan, this is an area you've worked in a lot. So, have you got a view on that? I think it's an interesting question.
Oh, this is a tricky question, man. I need weeks to prepare for that. It's brilliant. Look, what's going to clinch the deal might actually just be the housing crisis and its continued impact. I mean, we've certainly got now the National Party being really clear that, with a clear acknowledgement that there's a significant crisis that needs to be dealt with. The question is whether we can make the case that the human rights strategy or the rights-based national strategy and or an act which it enacts that and puts these protections in the most protected state they can be, whether we can make that look like the right solution for them, which is something I'd need a little while to talk about.
Yeah. No, and I would just add that I think I think there's lots of kind of obvious reasons why having cross-party support on something is great. Like I look at the fact that we've got New Zealand superannuation, we've got a national health, we're going now towards a national health service, building on what our DHBs have been. And those of, supporting a publicly delivered healthcare system has certainly served the country very well through COVID. And we were probably, nobody would want to have a go at that, only if not, but to improve it. Same with our superannuation system and things like that. So, but politicians always like to have a point of difference. And so I think the trick is that, and Kay, I've learned this from the work we've done together and your particular work looking back at how for the last 30 years, we simply have stopped building lower quartile housing. We stopped the finance for it. And quite frankly, governments of all stripes and colors over the last 30 years have been complicit in that activity. And so, and some would say to me, we've got bipartisan support on housing. For the last 30 years, it's meant we do nothing. So it would mean us having a different kind of bipartisan support around the actions and the interventions in the activity. And so I think we're hoping that rights-based framing helps do that. Let me go. So thank you, Rachel, for that. Nicholas, let's go to your question here. How important are partnerships across government and the community in the New Zealand model? Kay, you want to?
Well, I mean, I think they're absolutely important, but they're not necessarily what is the obvious and facile. I think there's a deep alliances of meaning and understanding between communities, between Māori and non-Māori, between urban and rural, which are necessary to partner in our aspirations. A partner in the strategy is the most important thing. Lots of partnerships which have material exchanges of resources are often actually quite unequal. They're unequal contracts in which some people, some groups get drawn into things which actually have long-term adverse consequences, not good consequences. So partnerships are important, but they have to be partnerships which are real, not imaginary, not people and organisations drawn into because they're fearful that they can't serve their own people if they don't.
Yeah, no, well said. Brennan, do you have anything to add on that one?
No.
Good stuff. All right, look, we'll see if we've got any other questions here coming through. We've got just about another minute. I might shout out to Jess if there's any things you're seeing, Jess, that you'd like us to cover. Or I might just kind of have us each go back around one each and any kind of wrap up comments you want to make. Kay, you want to go first?
Can I just start first? I have watched the community housing sector move over 30 or 5 years, and yes, I am very grey. I used to be 6 foot tall as well. And it's been an enormous joy to see the development that it has made. It's been great, despite adverse situations and the work of Scott and Brennan. And actually, key people do really matter, and they need to be awhida on. They need to be supported, because without them, those partnerships that we know we need won't get made.
Well said. Brennan, anything else in our last few seconds?
Good luck with.
Thank you. Thanks, Brennan. Thanks, Kay. Thanks
Scott.
everyone. Jess, thanks. Great.
And we're away.
Okay.
Thanks.